in some works by Clement of Rome, and in the Panarion of Epiphanius, you also have the information. Shalom. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about some of the doctrines of the Nazarenes. You can find these doctrines referred to and mentioned in some works by Clement of Rome, and in the Panarion of Epiphanius, you also have the information laid out there by Epiphanius. So the primary sources for information on the Nazarenes. In the Hebraic Roots movement, a lot of people talk about the Nazarenes, the Notzari, the Netzarim in Hebrew, and a lot of people claim that they're a Nazarene, that they're a Nazarene follower of Yeshua. But the thing is very, very few people actually know what their doctrines were. The general idea that you have presented to you in the Hebraic Roots movement is that the Nazarenes were just, Orthodox Jews who kept all the tenets of the Pharisaical style of Judaism, but they just believed in Messiah, and so that's what we think of as, a Nazarene. That's kind of the way it's portrayed. So people who are basically just, Messianic Jews who keep all the Messianic rabbinical Judaism kind of traditions, they're calling themselves Nazarenes. And the question is that really what the Nazarene faith was like? Is that really the doctrines that they followed? And many people have never actually went back and read any of the documents from the Nazarenes, read any of the historical references, or any of the mentions of them, and knew what they believed and taught. So we're going to go through some of these doctrines. Now, primary sources of information. One is a work by Epiphanius of Salamis. Epiphanius was a Catholic bishop. He wrote a heresiology called the Panarion. Now, Panarion means medicine chest, and so what it was is the Panarion was your cures for any heresy that you ran into. So you could, if you ran across this, a heresy, you could open up the Panarion and you could see how to refute that heresy. And so Epiphanius, he writes about the groups like the Nazarenes, the Ebionites, the Osaneans, the Edessenes, several other groups, the Nazareans. They're all basically the same group. So, Epiphanius describes these as being several different groups. However, he also says that they all followed the school of the Nazarenes. I think it was all the same group, personally. And I know there's some debate about that. Some people think that the Ebionites are separate from the Nazarenes and all this other stuff. I think it was all the same group, or possibly, in the same way that you could have, like Protestant Christianity, they all call themselves Christians, but within this group of Christians, there's Methodists and Baptists and, the Church of God, all these other denominations. I think that the term Nazarene is kind of like a blanket term for the entire group. And I'll show you a reference to Jerome where he describes it similar to that. Also, you can find some of the doctrines of the Nazarenes in a couple of works. One is called the Recognitions of Clement. I usually refer to this document as the Nazarene Acts. And then there's the Clementine Homilies. Now, both of these documents claim to be written by Clement. I have no reason to doubt that Clement at least wrote the source document behind these two documents. They are essentially, they're the same story. There are two different versions of the same story. It's like comparing the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Mark. There's differences between them, but they're basically very similar, same narrative, a lot of the same information. Parts of the homilies and recognitions are word for word the same, and then parts of them are very different. And I'll put a link in the description of this video so you can download a copy of the recognitions. And you can find the Panarion, the recognitions of Clement, the homilies of Clement. You can find all this stuff free on the internet. You can find PDF versions of it pretty easily. Also, we have various quotes about a document known as the Gospel of the Hebrews. It's sometimes referred to as the Gospel of the Ebionites. Basically, it is the original Hebrew Matthew. It's mentioned by numerous people. We have Jerome mentions it. Origen mentions it. Jerome actually claims to have translated it into Latin at one point. It's mentioned by Epiphanius. It's mentioned by Augustine. And we don't have the document anymore. The gospel according to the Hebrews has been lost. But basically, it's very similar to Matthew, but there's stuff that's been taken out of the Gospel of Hebrews, and then what was left, I think, eventually became the Gospel of Matthew. So you can see a lot of the Gospel of the Ebionites is still intact in the Gospel of Matthew, but it has been redacted to get to the point that it is now. So we can use references from these historians that quote from the Gospel of the Hebrews to get an understanding of what the Nazarenes believe. And again, I mentioned this earlier, the Nazarenes are sometimes referred to as different names. The most notable of these is the Ebionites. The Ebionites, it means the poor. So you hear that, like James, the brother of Yeshua, he is always associated with the Ebionites. James, of course, took over the Jerusalem assembly after the ascension of Yeshua. And so James was the head of the whole Yeshua movement from the ascension of Yeshua until his death in 62 Common Era. That's why in the book of Acts you always see the people going to James and asking James for decisions, and James is kind of like the ringleader, despite the claim that Paul was a ringleader of the Nazarenes. It was actually James. James was the one in charge. So we have this quote from Jerome to a letter to Augustine. This is known as letter number 75. So if you want to look this up yourself, you can find it that way. And again, Jerome says, "The matter in debate, therefore, or I should rather say, your opinion regarding it is summed up in this, that since the preaching of the gospel of Christ, the believing Jews do well in observing the precepts of the law." So the believing Jews is who he's talking about. He's not talking about the Orthodox Jews that reject Yeshua, but the Jews who are believers. He says, as all the Jews have been accustomed to do. So they observe the precepts of the laws, all the Jews have been accustomed to do. If this be true, we fall into the heresy of Cerinthius and Ebion, who, though believing in Christ, were anathematized by the fathers for this one error, that they mixed up the ceremonies of the law with the gospel of Christ and professed that their faith in that which was new without letting go of that which was old. Why do I speak of the Ebionites, who make pretensions to the name of Christian? Okay, so three things I want to point out here. A, I've already said it, he's talking about believing Jews. He mentions Ebion as if Ebion was a person. Now, a lot of these Christian historians believe that the reason they were called the Ebionites is because they were founded by a person named Ebion. That's largely regarded to be false. There never was a man named Ebion. It's just something that that these Christian historians presumed, I guess. So they always talk about how Ebion is in error. Ebion doesn't know what he was talking about, and they think that the Ebionites were founded by a person named Ebion. So anyway, but notice that he connects the believing Jews with the Ebionites. And so he goes on to say, in our own day, there exists a sect among the Jews throughout all the synagogues in the East, which is called the sect of the Mene, and is even now condemned by the Pharisees. The adherents of this sect are known commonly as Nazarenes. They believe in Christ as the Son of God, born of the Virgin Mary. They say that he suffered under Pontius Pilate, rose again, is the same as the one in whom we believe, but while they desire to be both Jews and Christians, they are neither the one nor the other. So again, you see here, Jerome is linking believing Jews to the term Ebionite and Nazareth. So it appears from what he's saying, the term Ebionite and the term Nazarene refer to the same group of people, not two different sects, as Epiphanius seems to think. So, Epiphanius mentions the travels of Peter. Now, here he's talking about the two documents from Clement that I mentioned earlier. It says, but the Ebionites use certain other books as well, supposedly the so-called travels of Peter written by Clement, though they corrupt their contents while leaving a few genuine passages. Clement himself convicts them of this in every way in his general epistles, which are read in the holy churches, because his faith and speech are of a different character than their spurious productions in his name in the travels. He himself teaches celibacy, and they do not accept it. So you know that the Catholic Church had this doctrine of celibacy. Even married people, they discouraged from having sexual relations. Of course, their priests were not allowed to marry and had to live, a vow of chastity. And the same with the nuns. The nuns were not allowed to be married or to have, they had to be virgins or whatever. And so, and a lot of times in these more Catholic documents, they always portray the apostles as teaching that even the wives are supposed to stop having relations, with their husbands and stuff like that. And I've always maintained that that's a Catholic creation. And you notice that Epiphanius, who himself is a Catholic bishop, is saying that the Ebionites reject this whole mess of celibacy. They see that Yahuwah created man and woman, and he created them for the purposes of becoming married and producing offspring through sexual relations. That's how you have children. So this teaching of celibacy here, you can tell it comes not from the Nazarenes, but it comes from the Catholic Church. So, I will also mention, keep in mind that Epiphanius is writing against the Ebionites. His book is a heresiology. It's a list of heresies. He considers the Ebionites to be a heresy, and so he's going to portray them in a negative light. So anything that he can say, that everything that he says, it's always, they're so-called this, or they're spurious that, there's stupid doctrine of this or that or whatever. So, Epiphanius, he's always going to talk about them in a negative light. So you see here where he's saying that they've corrupted the writings of Clement and they lie in their writings and all that stuff. He says that about all these sects because, he's a company man. He's here to stick up for the church and to keep people from going into this, whole, Jewish Christian groups. Okay. So anyway, I just wanted to point out that when we're talking about the recognitions and the homilies of Clement, that Epiphanius does mention that these documents were actually used by the Nazarenes and the Ebionites. Okay, so what are the doctrines of the Nazarenes? Here's one that you don't hear mentioned very often. In fact, it's very unpopular if you point out that the Ebionites and the Nazarenes were vegetarians. But the thing is, over and over and over again, there's these references to these, if you want to use the blanket term like, Jewish Christian groups, a lot of them were vegetarians. We've got numerous references that they were vegetarians. Here it is from the Panarion. Epiphanius says in the Travels, they have changed everything to suit themselves, and slandered Peter in many ways, saying that he abstained from flesh and dressed meat as they do, and any other dish made from meat, since the Ebionites entirely abstained from these. In the homilies, we see the same doctrine mentioned. Again, the homilies is an actual Ebionite document or Nazarene document. It says, however, such a choice has occurred to you perhaps without your understanding or knowing that my manner of life, that I, Peter, use only bread and olives and rarely potherbs, and that this is why my only coat and cloak which I wear, and I have no need of any of them, nor of aught else, for even in these I abound, for my mind, seeing all the eternal good things that are there, regard none of the things that are here. So Keith's, talking about how he lives a simple life, eats only bread and olives and some herbs. Again,